I'm going to do what historians do and actually read my paper, which I know is, we'll see how it goes. So as some of you in the room lived through, in 1991, Holyoke voted 3 times for mayor, once for Board of Aldermen and school committee members, and 13 times across 2 elections on whether to override the state limit on local property taxes and raise the city budget for various activities. Of these 13 votes on overrides, 4 passed, increasing the budgets for Holyoke's police and fire departments, the City War Memorial, and the City Council on Aging. 3 of the 11 failed votes would have raised property taxes to increase the Holyoke Public Schools budget, and all 3 failed, even though the school department was already making large cuts of a kind that we just can barely imagine now, thinking about what public school cuts looked like in the early 90s compared with now. So why do these votes matter now? Because 1991 was also when the State Board of Education and the state legislature in Massachusetts took up the cause of education reform. The story of the failed overrides for the Holyoke Public Schools, along with the overrides that passed for police, fire, solid waste disposal, the Council on Aging, and the War Memorial, became a core part of the State Board of Education's argument for a new law that would overhaul state governance of public schools, double state spending on public schools, and give the state the power to take over school districts that it had found to be, quote, chronically underperforming. The failed votes for school overrides in June and November of 1991 led the State Board of Education to conclude that the majority of Holyoke's voters and its city government couldn't be trusted to provide well-funded, effective public schooling to its increasingly Latino public school students. This led to the state receivership of the Holyoke Public Schools that recently ended. The Massachusetts Education Reform Act passed in 1993, bringing along increased state spending, but also, as I mentioned, the power to declare a school district chronically underperforming, which the State Board of Education did with Holyoke in 2003, then put it into receivership in 2015, extended the receivership in 2021, and ended it last year. And I'll confess that 25 years ago, when I came to Massachusetts and first started writing about education policy, including the standards-based reform model that the Ed Reform Act was based on, the state's interpretation of the Holyoke override outcomes made sense to me. But a few years ago, I started thinking about the situation more and realized that I was probably missing large parts of the story. So I have this idea in mind that I've just barely begun thinking about, but I want to do some deeper research into the entire history of the state intervention in the Holyoke Public Schools, possibly even going back to bilingual education and the racial imbalance law. But that's like the big thing that this is a small piece of. And I connected with Eileen here at the library, and here we are. And thanks so much to Eileen for helping me figure out how to access the transcript telegram and pointing Willow and me toward the Hello Holyoke archive and the Vecinos broadcasts that Willow may be the only human who has watched all of them, at least all the ones that are available online. So other sources that we consulted are the State Board of Education's report on distressed school districts and the Springfield Union News for some of the things that happened after the end of the transcript telegram. So the State Board of Education's understanding of what happened here in 1991 was incomplete. The State Board had a reform model in mind and needed to convince the state legislature to enact it. And as the saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To complicate the story today, we're going to remind you, or tell you for the first time if you weren't here then, of the details of what happened in 1991. The state economy was a mess, which made life difficult for Holyoke and similar cities around the state. Holyoke's Latino population faced barriers to voting, but it was also building political strength. Now that Holyoke has the ability to govern its own public schools again, we think this history can begin to inform some present-day decisions about the schools. So we'll begin with some background information on what was going on politically and economically here in the late 80s and early 90s. Then we'll summarize the arguments for and against the school overrides before we move into discussing the results of the two rounds of override votes, one in June and then the two questions about education on the November ballot. We'll tell you how the school override defeats affected the public schools and end with interpretations of what the vote said about city politics in the early 1990s. And standing here in Holyoke with a last name like McDermott, I feel like I have to offer a disclaimer. I'm not from here. I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which feels a lot like Holyoke. When I come to the city of Holyoke, it feels very much like Eastern Pennsylvania to me, except that we had a steel mill, and it's paper and textiles. My family does go back in Massachusetts, but it goes back in Waltham, not here. So moving on to the background information. So Holyoke, as you mostly know, began the 20th century as a global leader in production of paper and textiles. But by the 1970s, many manufacturing companies had left Massachusetts to go down south where labor costs were cheaper, to move production overseas. And the companies that stayed put, like I learned in this very room, one of which was National Blank Book, reduced employment here in Holyoke when they became part of multinational companies. And as Holyoke's industrial jobs disappeared, the city lost population. In 1950, the US Census counted 54,661 residents in Holyoke, which by 1980 had dropped to about 44,700, and by 1990 had dropped to 43,700. Despite the overall population decline, though, the number of Latino people living in Holyoke increased. People from Puerto Rico first came to Western Massachusetts as seasonal industrial workers and then stayed because there was inexpensive housing in Holyoke. And as bad as things were in the Massachusetts economy, it was stronger than some parts of Puerto Rico. Unlike earlier newcomers to the city, the Puerto Rican population here arrived at a time when the city's whole industrial sector was shrinking. So the previous procession into the mills and up into the middle class was not so much of an option for them. By the time that we're talking about, Latino residents of Holyoke were much likelier than others to have children in the public schools. So the shift in the demographics of the public schools in Holyoke happened earlier and was larger than the shift in the overall population. And we have a slide. And I'll try not to blind anybody with the laser pointer. So up top, we have, sorry, can't see my own slides. This is the population of the Holyoke Public Schools in 1990 and 2020. Sorry. Yeah, so what you can see here is that the school population in 90 was much more Latino already than the city was as a whole. So if you were talking about school politics in Holyoke at the time, it was, as in a lot of cities, the challenge was to get older residents who had been here longer to be willing to pay to educate what they thought of as other people's kids that weren't like them. Another difference for children whose families came to Holyoke from Puerto Rico, Ecuador, other places in Latin America, had a different experience in public school from European and Canadian immigrants, because beginning in the 1960s, state and federal laws required public schools to provide bilingual education programs for students who didn't speak enough English to understand what was going on in school. These programs required hiring new staff because few Holyoke teachers at the time spoke Spanish. State and federal grants paid many of these teachers' salaries, especially prior to the 1980s. But as budgets tightened at all levels of government, it was very easy for people whose kids weren't in bilingual education to blame the bilingual programs for cuts in other parts of what the schools were doing. And according to evidence presented later in a voting rights lawsuit that one of our audience members knows quite well, Citywide political campaigns often blamed the growing Latino population for the city's economic struggles. However, despite facing political barriers, by 1991, Holyoke's Latino population had begun to come into its own as a voting group. And we have here Betty Medina Lichtenstein, who won election to a ward-level school committee seat in 1985. She was the first Latino elected official in Holyoke, also the first in the entire state of Massachusetts. In 1985, when she won her election, Latino voter turnout was 22.8% of the voting age of the vote here in Holyoke, the result in part of a voter registration drive by the Holyoke Rainbow Coalition. Holyoke's second Latino elected official, Diosdado Lopez, was elected to the Ward 2 seat on the Board of Aldermen in the same 1991 vote that we'll talk about when the 2 school overrides were rejected. Another part of the context in Holyoke in the late 80s and early 90s was Proposition 2.5, which passed in the 1980 general election. The people of Massachusetts voted 59% to 41% to cap local property tax levies at 2.5% of a municipality's total property values. Proposition 2.5 also capped annual increases in local tax levies at 2.5%, except for taxes on new development. Proposition 2.5, if you're from a taxpayer standpoint, meant that property owners would no longer face unpredictable large increases in their annual tax bills. But at the same time, it made local officials' jobs much harder. Before Proposition 2.5, if you were the school committee and the municipal government, you could agree on a budget that met what you thought the city needed, and then assess a local tax rate that would pay for your planned expenses and that you believed voters would put up with. I mean, eventually, they might vote you out of office if they thought their taxes were too high. But after 1981, municipal budgeting, and this is still true right now, municipal budgeting begins with this 2.5% cap on how much taxes can go up, and then has to sort of fit in under that limit whatever local needs they can try to make. Worsening the situation during the 1980s was that the federal government under President Reagan cut back on aid to cities and towns and aid to states. So there was less slack in the state budget and the federal budget to pick up some of the things that couldn't be paid for with local money. The state went into recession again in 1989, and school budget cuts resulted. This is George Counter, who was superintendent of schools here at the time, and I'll pass over to Willow.
So the challenges faced by the Holyoke Public Schools didn't begin in 1991 with these overrides. For several years prior, schools had been feeling the effects of limited finances. In an article in Hello Holyoke in March 1990, Superintendent George Counter described his recent tour of all the schools in the district and said that teachers are, quote, hanging in there despite dwindling support from city, state, and taxpayers. In 1990, the district had 102 fewer teachers than the previous year. He said that the school committee is doing all they can to support teachers. On the same day, an article was published in the Springfield Union News titled "Holyoke Schools Await Layoffs," which stated that more layoffs and spending cuts, quote, appear inevitable as school officials prepare a budget for the 1991 fiscal year in a climate of continued uncertainty over the state budget and the amount of local aid. These cuts in local money would heavily burden the school system for the second year in a row. It also includes a quote from Counter. In the early 1980s, when we noticed teachers that they may not be rehired in the fall, people would say to us, "Don't worry, you'll get state aid in the summer and there won't be any layoffs." And it was true, the state aid came through. But nobody says that anymore, there is no more state aid. And a year later, in April 1991, when preparing for the 1991 to 1992 budget, the school committee made further cuts, including eliminating teachers' convention days and parent-teacher conference days, choosing not to reopen after winter break until the Monday after New Year's to save on utility costs, which created one of the shortest school years in Western Massachusetts, and they considered possibly closing Kirtland and or Metcalf elementary schools.
So moving on to the 3 municipal elections in 1991, and I'll say I've done since I was young, I've been involved occasionally in organizing in local elections, and I can't imagine 3 municipal elections in 1 year. That just sounds completely exhausting. So we'll be talking today about the Board of Aldermen, because that's what the body that is now called the City Council was called in the period that we're talking about. The reason that Holyoke had 3 municipal elections in 1991 was that Mayor Martin Dunn had left office for the Massachusetts Senate, so they needed to elect a new mayor to finish out Dunn's term. And it's a nonpartisan election, so there's a first round and a second round. So that's 2 of the elections. If you're a Holyoke City politics buff, this is the election where Bill Hamilton beat Joseph McGivern for mayor in June of 1991. The regular municipal election in November was again for mayor, because the term that they had elected Hamilton to was now over, so they needed to re-elect Hamilton or somebody and keep going. There are also seats up on the school committee and the Board of Aldermen, and 4 override questions, including 2 on the schools that we've mentioned. We're going to just summarize the arguments for and against the school overrides, which is going to be a little bit out of historical order, because the arguments just didn't change much between June and November. It was really kind of the same claims being made on both sides. So we'll describe those for you now, and then I'll move on and talk you through the details of what actually happened in the votes. So one of the arguments for the overrides was that the school simply couldn't function with any less money than they already had. The transcript telegram endorsed a yes vote on both the June and November overrides. A June editorial with the endorsement declared that enacting all 9 overrides that were on the ballot then for different city functions will be a financial sacrifice, but, quote, sacrifice is essential even in these very hard times. A guest essay by Christine Leary, who was the president of the Holyoke Teachers Association, was published in that same paper. She said, quote, I know my critics will label it as self-serving, trying to get teachers' jobs back. They're right, I am. She encouraged voters to separate the needs of the schools from their opinions on bilingual education or on the city's school administrators, because rejecting the school override wouldn't change who was running the schools, and bilingual education is a state requirement. Leary said, if you don't like it, you should make these views known to your state lawmakers. Willow will talk more about how the failure of the June school override led to turmoil as the school committee cut budgets, then restored cuts, then made different cuts. And I'll let you take it from there.
Okay. Is it possible to go back 1 slide?
Oh, of course.
I think.
Is that the one you wanted? Okay.
Yeah, this is the one. Yeah. So after the June vote, the school committee went back and forth on a lot of different ways that they could make their budget for this next year. Part of the challenge was that the budget they had planned on it already included cuts that would have been reversed if the June school override passed. And one big thing that they went back and forth on was the possibility of having a 4-day week in the fall. And while this uncertainty and this back and forth was somewhat understandable given the uncertainty of the financial situation, it didn't help to improve their credibility, and this sort of back and forth really then would go on to inform a lot of the debate around the November election. So on August 23rd, Hello Holyoke, and these are all headlines sort of from this time that were published in Hello Holyoke that they had someone who would go to school committee meetings and write a brief summary of what happened. So on August 23rd, there was an article saying that the school committee had approved a 4-day week, which included extended hours and a total of 151 days. Members pointed out that the 4-day week was presented because of the failure of the override vote as the only way to balance the budget. And people said, okay, if we don't implement this, it's going to further reduce our credibility. However, in mid-September, the committee did vote almost unanimously to return to the 5-day week, overturning the August decision after pushback from the public and the Holyoke Teachers Association. Members argued that there would not necessarily be the $600,000 in savings as previously suggested, and Mr. Counter said that if they were willing to go into debt, they might as well rehire teachers. Shortly after, the committee voted to allow the superintendent to recommend the hiring of as many teachers as needed to solve overcrowding issues after listening to stories from parents and teachers. The superintendent estimated that this would cost about $5.5 million, but committee member Ms. DiNapoli estimated that it would cost $9 million and said that this would drain the personnel account by mid-January, and teachers would not be able to receive their paychecks after that. Mayor Hamilton warned the committee not to get carried away and instead to work on supporting the override. In a final turnaround, the committee held another session to reconsider rescinding their action on rehiring teachers. They held a public discussion, and all who spoke supported their initial rehiring. Mayor Hamilton maintained that this placed the override in jeopardy and that they should rescind their earlier vote and campaign instead for the November override. But the motion to rescind the rehiring failed in a 5-5 vote. This was also covered in Hello Holyoke's reporting on the actions of the Aldermanic Finance Committee on October 1st. This was the article titled "School Committee Action Jeopardizes Override Future." When the committee met to discuss the Proposition 2.5 questions proposed by the mayor in this meeting, they noted that distrust of elected officials is rising, and the action may jeopardize the 2 override questions related to schools that would be on the November ballot. One was for fiscal year 92, and one was for fiscal year 93. The chairman of this Finance Committee also wanted to include a breakdown of how the money would be used on the ballot to help it pass, but the state does not allow this, and the aldermen were afraid that the $3 million price tag would scare voters. On October 1st, 1991, a resident published the same article in both Hello Holyoke and the Springfield Union News, advocating for the school override. This is kind of going back to our arguments for the override. He argued that state-level change in education funding was necessary to provide equal educational opportunity, but, quote, "For the present, we must do what we can to help the kids of our city get the best possible education under the current system." And he mentions that the school lost 220 teachers and a number of programs. He then goes on to respond to some of the common criticisms of the school override, such as the value of the bilingual program or the high rent on school department offices.
You can just stay put, I'll stay here. So another argument that was very prominent in 1991 was that the city's fiscal crisis wasn't the city's fault. Override advocates blamed the state budget cuts that I mentioned for Holyoke's situation and urged yes votes so that the city could begin solving its problems despite the pain of paying more taxes. The day before the June election, the Transcript Telegram front page featured a photo of a pro-override parade that featured an effigy of Governor Bill Weld. It's an old black and white photo. I didn't recognize it as Bill Weld, but maybe if I'd been around then, I would have. This argument wasn't new in 1991. In the previous year, 2 Transcript Telegram Board of Contributors members had called on city residents to fill the funding gaps left by the state in an essay headlined "Committing Communal Suicide," which was accompanied by a cartoon of a seesaw. On one end of the seesaw is being held down by a fat man in a suit. He looks a little bit like Michael Dukakis, so I think it might have been a kind of beefed up version of Dukakis, labeled "State Bureaucracy." The other end of the seesaw, high in the air, there's a skinny guy who looks terrified, and he's labeled "Cities and Towns." And again, the same caption was on the cartoon, "Communal Suicide." Moving on to the arguments against overrides, we've alluded already to the claims that were common in city politics at the time about welfare and Puerto Ricans and bilingual education, kind of combining all of these stereotypes into one argument about how the public schools just weren't doing their job anymore. In both Hello Holyoke and in the comment line features in the Transcript Telegram, you see the versions of my grandfather moved here from Quebec, my grandfather moved here from Ukraine, my grandfather moved here from wherever, didn't speak English, didn't need bilingual education, got a job in the mill right away, everything was fine. And as I mentioned before, the bilingual education program people would frame it, non-Latino people would frame it as this thing that the Latino community had demanded for themselves. But it was a state and federal mandate that would have been happening whoever the population in the schools that needed bilingual education at the time was. In August of 1991, in a front page article in the Transcript Telegram, Lisa Kernick reported on interviews with 12 city residents who did not support spending more money on schools. Some of them cited mismanagement. Some were critical of the city's Puerto Rican population and said that they felt they were paying taxes that benefited the minority group but not themselves. A retiree says, "Why should I pay for a school district where 85% of the kids speak Spanish and don't speak English?" The same retiree continued, "It's retirees living on a fixed income. They get the brunt of all this," meaning the tax increases, not those people coming from the Caribbean. Jane Fournier, a businesswoman, said she believes that many residents of Holyoke are, quote, "sick of benefiting the Hispanic people. They're paying money and they're not getting anything for it." In that same period in the city's history, Chris Koss, who ran successfully for the Board of Aldermen in 1991, was a leading voice for fiscal and cultural conservatives. She often critiqued welfare in the Holyoke public schools in many, many pieces for Hello Holyoke. A profile of her in the June 20th Transcript Telegram noted that these days it takes Chris Koss 2 hours to pick up a loaf of bread at the supermarket because so many people wanted to talk to her about the override. And it's interesting that the tagline in that article was that it was actually calmer in 1991 than in 1989. Like, people were less heated up about the override then. Another theme was mistrust in the Holyoke public schools, which I'll turn over to Willow.
So one consistent issue faced by proponents of the school override was a general lack of trust in the school department and the school committee. In the summer and fall of 1991, Hello Holyoke's columns for readers' comments was full of messages about what they saw as waste in the department. For example, in February 1991, a reader wrote, and quote, "I've wondered about this for more than a year. Why are the lights on in a room or rooms on the top level facing Beach Street at the Holyoke High from 4:30 p.m. until mid-evening? And Scuttlebutt on the Street says that the school department spent over $50,000 for lawyers in their unsuccessful lawsuit against the gas and electric department to a Springfield law firm." Or another example is, another reader calls and says that at the Kirtland School, they are renting a portable classroom when they have empty classrooms in the building. So these are just sort of meant to illustrate the kinds of concerns that people had and feelings about the department at this time. They also published an article on August 23rd titled "Eyebrows Raised as Reader Reveals School Department Questions," which questions why special education is the largest department in the school system and why the parent information director included salary increases for himself and other administrators in a grant proposal. At a meeting, someone said that Mr. Counter said at the meeting that his own estimates on savings for busings, utility, and etc. were not accurate. Why isn't he prepared with facts and figures? He owes the taxpayers accurate information, end quote.
And on that same theme, on the day after the June override election, a spokesperson for a coalition of business and community leaders that supported the override said that the questions that failed, which, as you'll see in a moment, included the school question, had a, quote, credibility problem. City residents also resented that so many public school teachers lived outside of the city. A few days before the November vote, a front page Transcript Telegram article noted, "Those who have publicly opposed the school override question say they are doing so because they believe the schools are being mismanaged. They also say that before they give any more money for the schools, they want to see changes in programs such as bilingual education and more accountability for the dollars being spent by the school administration." The article quoted Chris Koss, who said that School Superintendent George Counter just wasn't telling people enough about all the grants the schools get. It's the same kind of not really understanding that when the state and federal governments would give the public schools budget for a grant for one purpose, it wasn't a fund that they could dip into to pay for other things that the public schools might have needed to do. So now that you have a sense of how Holyokers debated the override, here are the details of the 1991 votes. These are the June 1991 override votes. You can see along the bottom, I labeled one of them various because it was this long list of, to my eye at least, unrelated city functions, but they were all in the same question. Then moving from left to right, you've got police and fire, which both passed. The blue bar is higher. Schools, which was rejected. The orange bar is higher. Then a failed override attempt for the library, where we are now. The historical commission, for solid waste pickup, for the public works department, and the Department of Economic Development. There was some person on the street said to the transcript telegram, I can't see that there's much economic development happening in the city. Maybe let's not give them any more money. Sorry, I got to that too early. It's interesting to note that even back in May, before the first round of the mayoral election, in fact, the day before the first round of the mayoral election, Joseph McGivern, who was acting mayor at the time and a candidate to be the mayor for real, and other officials traveled to New York City to meet with Moody's Investment Services because municipal governments have to borrow money sometimes. The transcript telegram reported McGivern as saying that the investment rating agency, quote, wants to hear we're attempting an override because it would be good for the city's finances. Despite that meeting, whether or not to hold an override wasn't a major issue in the first round of the mayoral election. This may have been because only one of the 4 candidates for mayor, Charles Smith, explicitly opposed an override. The differences among the other candidates were subtle. In fact, the transcript telegram quoted the city clerk as saying that he expected a low turnout because voters were confused about how the candidates were different from each other. In addition, we're back in May. McGivern and Hamilton came in first and second in that first round election with only 1 vote between them and advanced to the second round in June. Leading into the June election, the transcript telegram ran an article about campaign strategy which quoted Hamilton as saying that he would try to bring together anti-administration voters who had supported Smith and Murphy against McGivern, who as the acting mayor kind of, for better or for worse, owned the problems that the city had at that point. McGivern told the transcript telegram's Bill Zajac that having an override on the ballot might hurt his mayoral campaign, but he felt it was his responsibility as acting mayor to give voters a chance to have a say on funding for the departments that were scheduled for major cuts. Zajac also said, this is kind of getting to some of what Willow talked about, that the chances of an override passing might be enhanced if aldermen waited until November to put the override votes before voters because the public is still unwilling to believe that the cuts will actually take place. McGivern was right about how override votes would affect his mayoral candidacy, because as you see down in the left-hand corner there, he lost pretty solidly to Hamilton, who became mayor. And as again, voters rejected most of the override questions, including the one for the public schools. After this vote, the Holyoke Teachers Association had this is in Hello Holyoke, wasn't it? Yeah, this was in Hello Holyoke, thanking the 5,717 people who had voted for the school override, even though it had lost, and saying no surrender, which was their slogan at that point. In October of 1991, the State Board of Education stepped in. Their Committee on Distressed School Districts issued a report which slammed Holyoke voters for failing to maintain an adequate level of funding for the public schools even before the June override failed. The report called on the legislature to increase funding for public schools and to increase the state board's power over local school districts. This could include the state putting a school district in receivership, possibly the first time that word got used in conjunction with public schools. Moving on to the November vote, presumably that October report by the state board was one of the reasons why the Holyoke School Committee announced the day before the November vote that it was telling the State Board of Education to back off. The school committee voted to send the Board of Education a letter telling it that they were looking for financial help but did not approve of a takeover. School committee vice chairman David Martins said, "I don't trust Boston. I don't trust what they're doing down there. This is not what we're looking for." Betty Medina Lichtenstein, who you saw a picture of earlier, the one Latina on the committee, argued for caution. She noted that the State Board of Education's proposal would require legislation, so it might not happen at all. And in the meantime, she said, I think we would be cutting our own throats. We don't want receivership, but we need assistance. Let's wait, rather than say from the outset that we want to set the terms. On Election Day, November 5th, 1991, the front page of the Transcript Telegram reported that the Holyoke Taxpayers Association and the Chamber of Commerce had endorsed all of the override questions. And you don't normally have a taxpayers association asking people to vote to raise their taxes. With the conflict between the state and the city, the endorsements by not only these two economic groups, but the Transcript Telegram itself, a pre-election visit from Governor Weld, a pre-election visit from education equity advocate Jonathan Kozol, who was on book tour that fall, and all the hard feelings over the school questions lost in June, I was guessing that this election would have had a very high turnout in November, but it actually had a lower turnout than the June election. Articles in the Transcript Telegram refer to a general sense of disillusionment by the time the November vote came up. The results of the elections for the Board of Aldermen and the school committee are consistent with the idea that people who kind of casually but not very passionately supported the status quo stayed home because many incumbents lost. Among 6 new Board of Aldermen members was Diosdado Lopez, the first Latino member of the board. Another was Chris Koss, the conservative that we've mentioned earlier. And here are the results of the November overrides. Again, there were 2 school questions, as Willow mentioned. One was to increase the school's funding for the current academic year that they were in the middle of, fiscal year 1992. The other was to raise the budget for fiscal 1993. The solid waste disposal measure passed. The funding for the Council on Aging and the War Memorial passed. And this was not an override. It was a non-binding referendum about off-track betting, which failed. I have a friend who does environmental work in Holyoke who says that solid waste is always an issue in city politics. You guys can tell me if that's true or not. I wonder, though, as somebody who's done some local politics organizing, whether there was a little bit of a mixed opportunity in 1991, because if you look at the vote total, there were 5,717 yes votes in June of 1991. November of 1991, for one of the 2 school questions, there were only 5,669 no votes. So to a local organizer, this kind of looks like, oh shoot, if we had just gotten more of our folks, everybody who voted in June had come out and voted in November, we might have got one of the overrides passed. And looking at that made me wonder whether it was really fair to think about Holyoke voters as anti-school at this point. This graph is a little bit confusing, so I'll explain it to you. This is ranking all of the things that Holyoke voters voted on in 1991 from the most popular, which was the June police override, to the least popular, which was the Historical Commission. And you see here that the June vote on the schools really was one of the more popular things that voters in Holyoke considered in 1991. So despite the doubts about the school, what was going on in the school committee and in the school management and various racist things that white Holyokers said about Latino Holyokers, there does seem to have been some kind of grounding of support here for the schools that, again, I think about organizing and I wonder if that could have been different. But another thing that I went back and thought about after looking at these vote totals was how different the voting patterns were in the overrides in June and November, going ward by ward in the city. So this left-hand pie chart is just wards 1 and 2. So if you know Holyoke, at least then, that this was where most of the Latino population lived. On the June school override, wards 1 and 2 were 66% yes, 34% no for the school override. The rest of the city, the other 5 wards, was 65% no and 44% yes. So if you had somehow cloned the first and second wards and sent them out around the rest of the city, it would have been very different. Not that cloning was not an option here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that you had 2 very different city electorates here, as far as I can tell. Similarly, in November, on the fiscal 1992 school override, wards 1 and 2 went 62% yes, 38% no. Again, the other 5 wards were 40% yes and 60% no. The later override, the fiscal 1993 one, almost the same, 64% yes in the first and second wards, 36% no. In the rest of the city, 39% yes and 61% no. So another interesting difference between different parts of the city, don't panic, I'll walk you through this, is how different the total number of votes cast ward by ward were. This is June down here. You have 600 votes in Ward 1A, 329 in 1B, so lower levels of voters coming from the first and second wards here. Then you've got a couple of other wards that by themselves outvoted. One of these would have outvoted the first and second together, just huge differences in voter turnout. And it was the same in the November votes on both of these school questions. Far more people in the 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th wards voting than in the 1st, 2nd, and 4th. Just massive differences in voter turnout. And thinking about this, one thought that I had was, well, maybe there were different numbers of people in the wards, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because you're supposed to have wards being roughly the same size. It could be that one possibility, knowing that they redistricted in 1992, might have been that the wards really did have different populations in 1991. But there would have been difference in the numbers of people who were of voting age in the different wards, maybe a different interest in voting, and something that Willow is going to go into more detail about, barriers that existed to voting for Spanish speakers in Holyoke at the time. The school budget cuts part.
Yeah, got this. Yeah. So, wait, sorry. This part. I think I'm sorry.
That's okay. Do you want mine?
Okay, no, I know where I am now. Sorry. Yeah. So, the failure of the override questions had lasting effects. This is.
Oh, right.
Wait.
Back to the cuts.
Oh, no, this is fine. That's fine, yeah.
Okay.
The failure of the override questions had lasting effects on the program offered in the Holyoke Public Schools. By February 1992, the system was facing a $1 million deficit. And in 1992, this is something that I found through the Vecinos broadcast archive. A group of 7th grade students presented a student-written performance at the Magnet Middle School of the Arts called The Child Who Stopped the War, which was absolutely adorable and quite sad. In it, a student goes to see the principal and eventually the president, as sometimes happens in 7th grade drama performances, about concerns regarding her education. The student says, quote, "Well, I'm concerned about the student's education because there are 35 students to 1 teacher, which makes her less able to give us information for our plans for the future." And in this version, the president says, quote, "You know what? I think I'll reduce the class size to 20 students per class, and I think I'll restore the buses and give teachers the freedom they need to teach students." And it's a really sweet performance, but it highlights the fears of ordinary students in the system. On November 5th, 1992, Vecinos Neighbors aired an episode called A Year Lost for Education in Holyoke Public Schools, which was actually hosted by Orlando Azaza. who stated, no problem is more serious than the educational problems that we face now, and no program is more important than education for the future of our children and the future of our city. The episode highlighted that the economic recession, state and local budget crises, and the failure of 2 property tax overrides led to the layoff of about 220 teachers, cuts to academic programs, and the closure of 2 elementary schools. The school cut classes in art, music, physical education, computer instruction, and foreign language, often had more than 40 students to a class, and a chronic shortage of textbooks and school supplies. Also in 1992, both Superintendent George Counter and Assistant Superintendent Tim Barrett left the Holyoke Public Schools.
So putting together the voting data with the testimony about what happened to the public schools, the obstacles too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, why don't we move on to those?
No, okay. Sounds good. And sort of going back to our, the data presented on voting, the last question here, barriers to voting, there is ample evidence that the city did not make it easy for monolingual Spanish speakers to vote. In 1992, the community organization Vecinos Unidos de Barrio Uno, United Neighbors of Ward 1, filed a voting rights lawsuit against the city. And the court heard evidence of structural barriers to Latino participation. The plaintiffs cited a lack of bilingual poll workers and a lack of ballots and other literature about the elections available in Spanish, even though this is required by state law. Some ballots and materials were printed, but not enough for everyone, and only in the majority Latino wards, although there were Spanish speakers spread throughout the city. They also said that the city has a policy of dropping people from the voting rolls without notice if they fail to fill out a town census that is printed only in English. So sometimes voters would go to the polls expecting to vote and be told that they weren't on the list. And at this point, people were often not told about their rights. The person who works for the city has an obligation to call or go to City Hall to check if the voter is registered, not the voter themselves, but many people were not made aware of this. And telephones to call City Hall were often placed far away from the polls, so making a call created a delay in voting, especially in wards where many people had this same problem. And the plaintiffs in this case argued that there should have been redistricting as well after the 1990 census to ensure the one person, one vote principle of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was carried out, especially as the Latino population was concentrated in wards 1, 2, and 4A. They also sought the elimination of at-large representation on the city council and school committee because the at-large system meant that candidates seeking election did not need the Latino vote and did not have to be receptive to the needs of that community because of the white majority of the city. And in an interview discussing the lawsuit, which aired on Vecinos Neighbors in 1993, plaintiff Lillian Santiago Garcia specifically pointed to the school's override question in 1991. She argued that the question was especially important for Latino voters because 71% of the students in the schools were Latino. However, because of these obstacles, and especially the printing of information only in English, many parents did not know that if they didn't support question 4, the schools wouldn't get more money. And then the majority of the people who had to deal with these adverse impacts were Latino children in the public schools. Thanks.
So wrapping up, if putting the testimony that Willow's talked about with the voting data that I presented, it's clear that the wards in Holyoke where the majority of the Latino population lived had different preferences about the overrides from the rest of the city, and that they voted in much smaller numbers than the rest of the city. The evidence presented to the federal court shows that it was much harder for Spanish speakers than for others to vote in the city in 1991. But at the same time, the State Board of Education's insistence that only external intervention could solve the problem here strikes me at least as having been overstated. The override questions in 1991 were supported by the city newspaper, the Transcript Telegram, the Chamber of Commerce, the Taxpayers Association. We can't know because there's no polling to tell us why turnout was lower in November of 91 than in June. But it's worth wondering whether turnout and override support would have been higher if voters had realized that they weren't just voting on a tax increase, they were implicitly voting on the city's future control of its public schools. A colleague of mine made that point when we presented this at UMass a couple of weeks ago. He said they thought they were voting on a tax increase, and it was really much larger than that. Also, the State Board of Education seems to have assumed that Latinos in Holyoke would always be an easily outvoted minority, that it wasn't possible to convince non-Latino voters to meet the needs of the public schools, and that outside consultants would have better answers to Holyoke's educational challenges. Looking back on the 1991 votes, it's clear both that there were real obstacles to Latino voting and that those obstacles didn't have to be permanent. There was a voting rights case, the population was growing. There's a real opportunity as populations change to find common interests across the city's communities and strengthen community voice in the schools. There were, I think it was about a dozen external advisors and consultants came in and were paid with state money during the period of the between 2003 and the end of the receivership. I'll end on a positive note that, with the end of the receivership, and it might just be symbolic, but it struck me as a nice end to the story, seeing the photos of Mayor Garcia as the Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Tralee, Ireland, which is Holyoke's sister city. I guess they got him singing along to a Bee Gees song about Massachusetts. Seems like it was a very high point, a big high point for the idea that you could be a Puerto Rican mayor in Holyoke and also honor the fact that there was a large Irish community in the town. So I hope that there is reason for progress in the future, and thank you all for listening. How much time do we have for questions? Comments? Corrections? Yes?
In an effort to be transparent, I'm Superintendent Compton.
That's who I thought you were, yes.
Oh, Laura, you're here.
I am.
Jesus,
Yes,
I broke out in a cold sweat. Hello.
That's right, you two would have
God,
been.
Give me a break.
He's the best.
Yeah, that was.
It's just so great that you're here. I don't often get the experience of people I've just talked about showing up in the audience.
Yeah, the story behind the story, my least favorite governor, Weld, came to Holyoke before the Prop 2.5 override. We met in the mayor's office along with other city departments. The Boston Globe and half the world was outside waiting to find out what was going to go on at the meeting. At the same time, the Armory, for those of you who are familiar with Holyoke, the Hampden County Jail had closed and they relocated prisoners to the Armory. So the governor was really here to visit the Armory, to get them money so that there wouldn't be criminals running around the neighborhood. He was less interested in 40 kids in the classroom, etc. So at the end of the meeting, I asked the governor that the press is going to be waiting outside. Would you go out and strongly urge the good citizens of Holyoke to vote yes on the override tomorrow? And you know what his answer was. It's a local issue. You'll have to decide it yourself. So I said, well, that's really nice of you, isn't it? From there, we went to the Lawrence School. He went with a state trooper. We met over there. He wanted to visit a bilingual class with 40 children in it. So he went into the class with an armed state trooper.
Armed?
Well, of course, they were armed. You had to carry an arm. And he said, "Buenos dias," to the class, and they all said, "Buenos dias." And they stayed, and the Boston Globe interviewed me in the hallway. And then we went from there to the Armory and to the Early Childhood Center, which was right across the street. Following his visit to the Early Childhood Center. The press waited for him because he was leaving to go back to Boston. And they said, Governor, there were 40 kids in that class. What did you think of that? He said, well, I thought they were well behaved. Governor, they're breaking the law. The law says that there can't be any more than 25 children in that class. What do you want me to do? Arrest them? And then they said, would you like to have your child in that class, Governor? And he said, well, it wasn't like they weren't learning nothing. Number one in his class out of Harvard. It wasn't like they weren't learning nothing. And then he left. And the next night after the override, because Channel 22, NBC News, Tom Brokaw, compared Holyoke's override at that time, you could probably get the tape of it, with some community in North Shore Boston that was spending $15,000 or $20,000 per student while we were spending $5,000 or whatever. And he said, tomorrow they're going to have an override in the city, and they compared the two districts. They showed Newton Street, you know, all the bad parts of Holyoke, compared it to, I don't know what. And then the next night, following the override, the last minute of the NBC nightly news nationally, Tom Brokaw said, last night we showed, you know, a serious educational issue facing Holyoke, Mass. I'm here tonight to let you know that the citizens of Holyoke voted for trash over the schools. Welcome to my world.
Yeah, but you were the star of the McNeil Error segment.
Star.
The
The idea was to come up with the money. We went to the State Board of Ed, and this is what I said to the State Board of Ed, with the support of the Holyoke School Committee. At the end of their meeting, any new business, is it, you know, the superintendent, I said, well, here's the situation in Holyoke. We're going to start in September. This was the summer, you know. We're going to have 40 kids in the class. We're going to have, we're asking for a 4-day school week, not a longer school day. We have to have 900 hours. So we'll have, instead of a 5-hour day, we'll have a 6 or a 7-hour day, but we'll get it done so that the kids can have a midwinter break like they do at UMass. Get out at Christmas, come back after, and we'll save 20% of our school bus transportation. And all of this madness, it was complete madness. I cut the whole after-school program, Holyoke High School football, all gone. Was funded by a volunteer group, $250,000. So the state board member said, you know what, I'm in private business, and if somebody came, one of my employees came and told me this was going to happen in my business, that I would consider that a power outage. We'd be out of business. We can't let that happen. So they came up with a committee to come and visit Holyoke. I refer to it as the Potato Famine Commission. You know, when the Irish were dying in the streets of Dublin because they didn't have food, the king said, well, we got to have a commission go over there and see if that's really true. So they had a potato famine. I told them that I was going to call them the Potato Famine Commission. And they visited all the schools, and the good governor gave us $6 million more in January. Of course, 200 teachers had already left. Now I'm calling you, you know, we got your job back. Well, you know, it's not bad here in Chicopee. It was just putting Humpty Dumpty back together. It was a disaster.
And then didn't the city have to pay some of that money back to the
Probably.
state in the end?
But
Yeah.
what most people, I have cold sweats reading the paper now about, you know, now that the override people are gone, the city council's in charge of the budget. I mean, the school boards ask. They ask in Amherst, they ask in Northampton. Everybody asks, you know, support the schools. Well, it ends up down in the council office. There's only one budget for the city of Holyoke. You can't have it all, Mr.
Right.
Counter. You have to learn with what you have. Well, there you are.
Well, thank you. It's
And Mayor Hamilton, by the way, said, George, you know, you should look. for something else, you know, because things don't look good. Dark clouds are on the horizon, but 5 new board members, so.
Right.
I went to Thomaston, Connecticut with 1,000 students in the school district. 135 in the high school. 912 high school with 135 kids. And my benefits paid for, where in Holyoke I had to pay half, so. And $20,000 more on the salary end.
And that lovely bar around the corner where they would give you the little
Yeah,
wooden nickels.
yeah, firearms, yeah.
Firearms.
But, yeah, there are a lot of stories. And we closed 4 schools and desegregated the elementary schools, where uptown and downtown Holyoke came together for the first time in the public schools, because downtown was as crowded with 38 kids in the class, while the uptown schools had 12. And the Hispanic population said, that ain't
Yeah.
fair. So, and it wasn't, so we got it fixed.
Well, thank you so much. I'll be in touch. I want to hear more.
Yeah.
There was a hand there. Thank you.
My name is Meg McGrath-Smith. I'm the Ward 7 City Councilor. And a couple things that I was thinking about. One, the voting map up there is not that different now in terms of the turnout percentage if you are looking at between ward to ward. But also, similarly to your question or your point around how they weren't allowed to put the information they needed to put in the ballot question to make it clear. At least at the state level, if you have a ballot question, they put out the yes/no ballot book. And so you get clear information. But somehow for municipal elections, right, we're not allowed to put information on a ballot that makes it clear the impact of that vote. This happened with the CPA question that just passed. I had created a grid. If you vote yes and your house is assessed at X, you will save $17. If your house is assessed at this, you'll save $8. And it was like, you know, if your house is valued at $400,000, you'll save $8, right? And it made it so clear. The language itself was so opaque that it was not to be understood. The number of people who read that ballot question and were calling me, people who said, I did the right thing, I voted yes for CPA. And I was like, oh, no, that was the wrong, you're supposed to say no, right? So, and we were kind of fed that same argument, which I found hard to be believed, that we weren't allowed to make a ballot question that made sense, that could actually make it clear to the people what they were voting for, what the impact would be.
Yeah.
My other question is, because there were so many possible override votes, I really wonder if it's almost a split ticket effect. Did it make it, people could feel good about themselves, like, well, it's like the middle of the road compromise vote. I'm saying yes to these, but no to these others.
I think that's likely, and I also, one thing I didn't get a chance to do before this presentation was to go back and look up the dollar amounts of all the overrides, because I think the school overrides were the largest
Right.
on the ballot,
We
so.
can't do the large ones, but we can do all the smaller ones. Like,
Yeah.
it might have felt to people like that was the compromise they were making.
That's the worst, that's the worst way. The mayor decided to have a Chinese menu.
Right. Do
That's-
you know how they, what?
Now it's one question, do you vote for the override? It's
Yeah.
not schools,
Do you know
police
who
and fire.
decided on the order on the ballot, what order they'd be presented in?
It's gotta be a lottery.
I don't know.
No, because they were numbered, so they were on the same order on everybody's
So there was
ballot.
a
Ballot
separate
questions are
question
bad
for
for order.
each override.
That's right,
And it said, do you approve override for police? Do you approve
Exactly.
override? So it
Yeah.
was like 8, 10
it was
questions.
9 in June and it was 5 in November.
It's an interesting question about the order there.
Yeah, I know now with computer technology, ballots tend to have things in random order, so like my husband and I might not have the voting from the same address, might not have our propositions listed in the same order.
Yes, for the first 3 and.
Yeah, because that could happen, yeah. Yeah, question?
Well, sort of contributing to this discussion, I've often seen police and fire pitted against schools
Oh,
in
yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
overrides and libraries too. Like it's like oh, well, we have to protect ourselves from the scary people in our town, but not educate our kids or libraries.
Yeah, wards 1 and 2 voted yes on everything. And both lists of possible overrides, police, fire, historical commission, council on aging, they were pro-government.
The other thing that happened is that the schools, prior to '92, did not have to budget for heat and light and maintenance. Like if you needed a new roof, the city owned the schools and we were the occupants. Now, we took care of the furnishings and that kind of stuff, but the heat and light was paid for by the city. If that window got broke, the city would send somebody up to fix it. That wasn't in the budget. But the board always wanted to have control of the schools, because the city never takes care of things when they get broke, all right? So the mayor said, great, you got them. But he didn't transfer the money. He took the $4 million out of the town side, shifted it over to the schools, and said, you got it. And I said, well, where's the money? He said, well, you guys wanted it, you got it. You're not getting the money. He used the money that year to pay for police and fire, you know, raises on that side of the street. And we were left, and that's why we ended up suing the gas and electric, you know, because we said, you know, go to the mayor and get it. We don't have $2 million to pay.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, you've been trying to get in.
So why, maybe you said this, but why did they bundle all of those separate things together? They were like, oh, we're gonna vote on 2.5 on X thing.
You mean, why did they separate them out rather than just have one big override?
Or all, the override for all those individual things.
Yeah.
Why not have one vote on the schools?
We
And
would
what
need
was the
some,
first thing that they said we need an override for?
yeah, we would need some old aldermen here, I think, to, unless Mr. Counter knows. I know that
It's
again,
just-
I've
there's
done some
only one
overrides
budget.
and you just
You have
don't
to
know.
vote on just one budget. There's
they're
only
missing-
one Holyoke, city of Holyoke budget.
Right.
Which
But that.
when 2.5 passed, they lost control of the budget, the school board. You know, they could ask for the money, but the mayor and the council had to approve it. It became another department. If you had a bad mayor, you send the budget down, he said, I'm not approving that, I told you to come in at 3%, you guys come in at 4%, I'm cutting 1% off of that budget. Then pass it on to the council, you needed 2/3 to override the mayor's cut, as I recall. It's just,
So that was everything that the city, is in the city budget?
There were some things that they didn't put up for overrides
Yeah.
also, yeah.
Why, and why not?
Good question. I don't know the answer. Maybe they just didn't sound appealing enough. Like actually in the June override, there was this very mixed bag question that didn't pass, and they broke it apart in November, and that was when they kept the Council on Aging and the War Memorial together in one question, but separated out some of the other things. I think,
What happened to Parks and Rec?
Right.
good question.
All the things that aren't.
Yeah, I
in the
just don't,
budget.
that's a great question that I should find out the answer to.
I think that was the time when they were doing illegal dumping in like community field and stuff like that. They didn't need money.
yeah. So the long and the short of it is what, from your perspective, on
Yeah, so I've done a big shift in my own thinking about state education reform. You can go look up the book I published in 2011 about state education reform in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey, where I didn't frame it as a big pro that, it's not a book that is really strongly in favor of that approach, but I took a lot more of the advocates' arguments at face value when I wrote that book than I would now. Like, for example, I interviewed Paul Revel and Marty Kaplan, who were on that committee that came to Holyoke, and was Holyoke, Brockton, other places, and the ones that said that Holyoke was abdicating responsibility for its public schools. And the more that I thought about that, it's been a long time now, the more that I thought, yeah, maybe, but they were in there was a real financial bind going on. They weren't the only city that was in this position. They weren't uniquely horrible. It doesn't seem right to me that Holyoke got the full weight of the state on them from 2003 to 2015, to 2024. And over those years, I had in my classes at UMass some educators from the Holyoke Public Schools and some administrators, and they would just kind of roll their eyes, like, all right, here's this year's nonprofit, this is the thing we're doing, it's gonna fix our schools. Oh, this time it's for-profit, okay, but they've got the thing that's gonna fix our schools. And it's not obvious to me that things went better here than they did in similar cities where they didn't have various people breathing down their necks for 21 years about running the public schools. So it seems like moving forward, there is an opportunity to, particularly with Holyoke now, being a city that can elect a Puerto Rican mayor, that it's not an outvoted population anymore. It seems like there's an opportunity to listen to the positive voices in the community that I'm sure were here, just maybe not in the newspaper.
The other thing that was happening at the very initial stages was technology was starting to rear its head into the schools. Computers, who was going to pay for computers and the wire and all of that.
And why are we paying for computers?
Yeah.
Right.
But the whole thing to me is it comes down to the kids in the schools, Holyoke, and nationally, we have kids in the school are kids of color, and the white communities are not going to support them. And if that becomes an issue, it's an issue in Thomaston, Connecticut. Why do we have to pay for these kids? They don't speak English, to this, to that. They come from Afghanistan now. Blah, 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 blah. I said, that's what we are as a nation.
Right.
They need to be educated. That's our future. We're passing the torch to them. People don't want to hear it.
No.
What about me? How about my senior citizen? How about my Medicaid? That was my speech in Thomaston. When I grew up, my grandmother lived with me. We didn't have the elderly tower. We didn't have Medicare. My father found a way to take care of grandma. You know what I mean? Now you want everything. What about little Johnny? They don't want to hear that. My wife used to kick me. Shut up. So I'm shutting up.
Laura,
But it's a national project, and the president just did away with the Department of Ed.
oh, yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's...
So you don't think it's real, it's coming.
I study federal educational civil rights policy, so
Yeah.
it's actually less depressing to think about Holyoke in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So two questions.
Yeah.
One, you mentioned, I think only 3 newspapers, but the Springfield Republican, the Holyoke Transcript, and you included Hello Holyoke as a newspaper.
As a news source, because it's here in the
Well,
library.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I would suggest that you might want to revisit those 3 papers. There's a lot of backstory on
That's
Hello Holyoke.
absolutely, and I think about the transcript telegram as well. I would love to know who picked the voicemails that they ran in the newspaper. They would
Those
say,
are anonymous.
right, but the
And that
people,
was following Hello Holyoke,
Yeah.
which decided to do that kind of a hate line. And so the transcript picked it up, in my opinion, as a desperate last attempt to keep the paper running. So that concerns.
I want to know more about that, definitely.
Go ahead.
I'll finish and then, yeah, I should.
And then, where are you going with this research from here? I'm very interested now. What is the next step for research?
Willow, do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the Hello Holyoke thing. So I had the same, I read a lot of it and I had the same feeling, and I feel like a lot of it I'm definitely taking with a grain of salt. I think what the places where at least I was including information from Hello Holyoke was more about illustrating concerns or general fears of some people of especially readers of that paper, less as like a fact. I definitely,
It was a family newspaper.
yeah, like
Family
it was,
newsletter.
yeah, I don't, at least for me, I wasn't considering it as the same type of super credible, factual source.
Yeah.
I didn't.
I'm glad you picked
I did
that
not
up.
take it that
Oh,
way
yeah.
at all.
That
And the places
concerns
it was included was, this is the type of things that people might be reading as they're going into this override.
Right.
This is what they're hearing about schools from this.
It's sort of data about what people were saying than data about what's
Yeah.
true.
And the,
Because it's not of the same.
yes, definitely, and thank you for bringing that up. This, yeah, that was what I was interested in. And I think the school committee reports were helpful because they were also sort of taken with a grain of salt, but those were a little bit more, there just wasn't a better record of individual meetings. And for things like this, at this meeting, they discussed the pool and hiring teachers and maternity leave for 3 people. I felt like that was
There
pretty,
should be a word-for-word transcript of the school committee meetings, because there was a woman who used to sit there with us.
Oh, like a court stenographer, yeah.
Yeah, if you know where those are, Laura, I would be delighted with my choice.
I don't know where they are. I would ask Nilka Ortiz, or I would check with Kelly Curran. They might know, or George might know where they went.
We don't have
What's
any
that?
reports for any city
Where did the
department after
stenographer-
1968.
Remember?
The
this-
transfer?
Yeah, no, for the school committee meetings. What was her name? She used,
Elizabeth Colbert.
no, before Liz.
Oh,
Excuse me.
A
oh, yeah.
woman, she married Judge Moriarty. She was a
Shirley
widow.
Camus.
That's right, Shirley Camus.
Shirley
She
Camus.
sat there
I have to
and
leave.
recorded every single.
Caretaker, so I have to get to my care. Tommy, good seeing you. Good seeing you. There no bra.
He's braver than
See you guys.
So Liz Colbert might know. Kelly Curran, who's the director of personnel for the city, she used to work for the school department, she may know. Or Nilka Ortiz, the mayor's assistant, would somehow be able to figure this out, but I'd
Yeah,
start with
the real
Liz.
question is what they kept and where they kept it.
Yes.
Probably in
Some
a
of these
box
records are
on
kept-
Suffolk Street.
They're kept for a year or two, and then, they either lose track of them or they throw them away.
Yeah.
So
Sometimes
they-
you get lucky, though. I have a friend from grad school who walked into the Arlington, Virginia, some Northern Virginia school district, and he said, I'm just really curious about what things were like here during school integration. And they said, oh, come down the hall. And they opened up this door, and it was just boxes to the ceiling.
Start with Liz Colbert.
And it was a book in the end.
Koeber.
So to your point.
And where are you going next with the
Oh,
research?
so I don't entirely know yet, but what I want to do is, I think what I need to do first is follow the story forward in history and learn more about what the state did when it was here.
It's still here,
I know it's still here, but when it was really, really here, like when I
but
was,
they haven't ended it.
Yeah.
It's not ended.
really?
It's not ended.
Yeah, I was just getting filled in. I don't remember the details, but they're gonna try to not give the collective bargaining back or something.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So
that-
that's their little
Yeah,
trick,
union
basically, they're
busting.
gonna keep their little control board in place by doing that or something. I don't know, Meg was just filling me in on it.
Yeah, so where I come to this issue as somebody who's been probably abnormally fascinated by relationships between local, state, and federal governments, and in particular in the US, until like a couple months ago, the way that the division of labor worked out was that the federal government and the state government kind of got the job of trying to keep things equitable. But we do public school in the US in this very hyper-local way that no other country does. It introduces inequities into the system about money, about the level of need that gets concentrated in one school district and not in another. And back in my 20s, I would think about all this and say, well, clearly the state needs to come in when you've got these school districts that just can't run their schools or won't run their schools. You need the state come in and fix it. But now that I'm in my 50s, I can look back and say the track record of the state fixing things is just not so great. And part of that is that we are collectively demanding of our public schools that they do something that our public schools have never done, which is educate all children to the same high level, the same level of opportunity, the same level of intellectual engagement and challenge. We've always done it really, really well for some kids and much less well for other kids. And it matters a lot which town you happen to go to school in or which towns you happen to go to school in. And I'm just still fascinated by all the different ways that people take this. I mean, it's not even a Rube Goldberg device, because when you do something at one end of a Rube Goldberg device, something happens at the other end. Sometimes it's not even a Rube Goldberg, just you do stuff and nothing happens. I just want to know more about what happened here. And in particular, I feel like nobody that I was listening to, at least, was saying enough about what kinds of educational activities and initiatives were going on within the Puerto Rican community. That, you know, was anybody tapping that? Who was talking to whom? Whose opinions about the schools were taken seriously? So I think first.
Move fast, because some of those people are already dead.
I know, but people like 10 years ago are probably still around. So that's a good reason to move forward to the present with the story first.
And those other people will be dead. Like, so you mentioned the 636 director.
Oh, yeah.
He's gone, he's dead.
Yeah.
You can't, and Bobby had all that information. John Mahoney had all that information, he's dead.
You think any of their kids kept boxes of stuff?
No.
No?
John Mahoney was single,
Okay.
and the O'Neill kids wouldn't have kept it. But I know some people.
Yeah, no, I definitely, we need to touch base again. We were on a dissertation committee together.
I was teaching in
Yeah.
91. I was at the Magnet Middle School for the Arts.
Do you remember the performance?
Mm-hmm. I do. And they're having a reunion.
I'll give you my email address.
Yeah, you need to talk to those kids.
Yeah, no, I do. And I was here for the event a couple of years ago about the National Blank Book Records, and that made me completely fascinated with on-the-job training, because that's another part of the story, is expecting public schools to train everybody to do exactly the job that they might get one day, where it sounds like you could walk into National Blank Book and they would say, oh, you're good at office work, we'll teach you how to be an office worker, or you're not so good at office work, we'll teach you how to do something on the production line. And these days it would be, well, why didn't you go to production line school? You know, where's your off-the-shelf credential for this? You're looking at me like we need to stop.
I just want to give you a break. We've kept you up there in the hot seat, you and Willow, for quite a long time now. So I want to give you another round of applause and then let you keep talking if you want.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.